I think the one I enjoyed reading more than anything else was Harry Potter.
Under the gilded ceilings of Britain's most guarded palaces, treasures have been passed down for centuries, symbols of history, power, and unbroken tradition. But when whispers emerged that irreplaceable royal jewels were vanishing, suspicion turned inward. At the center of the storm stood a figure no one expected: Queen Camilla. What began as quiet murmurs spiraled into one of the most explosive scandals the monarchy had faced in decades. And when irrefutable evidence landed on Prince William's desk, he was forced to make a decision that would shake the crown itself. This is the story of betrayal, exposure, and a title stripped. The rumor that wouldn't die. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like a faint draft slipping under a closed door. In the early months of spring, a few palace aides exchanged knowing glances during a routine inventory of the royal collection. They said nothing publicly, but behind their polite smiles was the same unspoken thought: something was missing. At first, it was easy to believe the explanation offered by the senior curator, that certain items were on long-term loan to museums or had been moved for restoration. The royal vaults contained thousands of pieces, each with its own history and purpose. It was not unusual for a diamond tiara to be away from its case for a few weeks. But as the weeks turned into months, and more than one storied piece could not be accounted for, the whispers began to curl through the corridors. In the grand salons where portraits of past monarchs kept their eternal vigil, the staff lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned. A sapphire brooch worn by Queen Victoria at her coronation anniversary. A pearl choker famously gifted to the late Princess Diana by a Middle Eastern ruler. Even the ornate diamond-encrusted snuff box, a relic from the Georgian era, was nowhere to be found. All had been logged in the previous year's records, yet now their location was marked only with vague notations. No one dared suggest outright theft within the royal household, but the unease was growing. The palace, for all its grandeur, thrived on a fragile balance of trust and tradition. For generations, the jewels had been kept under the tightest security, guarded not just by alarms and steel vaults, but by an unshakable code of loyalty. To even imagine that someone from within might be responsible was unthinkable. And yet, the evidence, or rather the absence of it, was becoming harder to ignore. It was a chance remark at a private charity event that deepened the sense of unease. A well-connected art dealer from Geneva mentioned over champagne that a remarkably rare royal-style tiara had been purchased in a discreet auction by a private collector in Monaco. The tiara's design was almost identical to one believed to still be in the Queen Mother's personal collection. The dealer had laughed it off as a convincing imitation, but the comment lingered in the minds of those who overheard it. Inside Kensington Palace, Prince William's aides began quietly cross-checking records, comparing old photographs to the current holdings. The deeper they looked, the more irregularities appeared. Pieces that should have been worn at state banquets had not been seen in public for years. Official explanations seemed increasingly thin. Still, the rumors refused to solidify into proof. No one wanted to bring such an accusation to the future king without certainty. Yet the story would not fade. It lingered in the air, whispered in servant corridors, murmured in the corners of formal receptions, an ever-present question no one dared answer aloud. In that tense and watchful atmosphere, the first discreet moves were made to find the truth. And though no one could have known it then, the trail would lead far closer to the heart of the royal family than anyone dared imagine. The discreet investigator, the unease that had taken root within palace walls, could no longer be ignored. By the time the third missing piece had been quietly noted in the official records, Prince William knew the matter had to be handled with precision. Public scandal was the last thing the monarchy needed, yet the loss of irreplaceable heirlooms could not be swept aside. It was not enough to rely on the explanations provided by the keepers of the royal collection. If there was truth to the whispers, it would take someone outside the usual channels to uncover it. William's choice was deliberate. He turned to Simon Harcourt, a former intelligence officer who had transitioned into private security consulting. Harcourt had worked on sensitive assignments for the royals before, each time with quiet efficiency and without a trace of his presence in the press. He understood the weight of discretion, and more importantly, he understood the stakes when loyalty was in question. Their meeting took place in one of the lesser-known drawing rooms of Kensington Palace, a space rarely used for public engagements. The heavy curtains were drawn, muting the daylight, as William outlined the problem in measured tones. He spoke not as the future king, but as a man determined to protect his family's legacy. Harcourt listened without interruption, his eyes narrowing slightly at the mention of private auctions and Geneva dealers. When William slid a small leather-bound notebook across the table, containing a list of the missing pieces and their histories, Harcourt accepted it with a nod. The first step was to cross-reference the palace's own records with those of reputable auction houses, both public and private. Harcourt worked from an unmarked office in London, sifting through archives, sale records, and photographs that spanned decades. He knew that if genuine royal pieces had surfaced for sale, they would have been disguised under vague descriptions or sold through intermediaries. That trail, however faint, could still be traced by someone who knew what to look for. Weeks passed with little to report. The work was meticulous and slow, often hinging on tiny details such as the cut of a gemstone or the engraving on a clasp. Then, one late evening, Harcourt found a match. A diamond necklace listed in a discreet Parisian auction bore an uncanny resemblance to one worn by Queen Elizabeth II during a state visit in the early 70s. The seller's name was hidden behind a corporate front, but the transaction had been facilitated through a well-known luxury broker with ties to several European royal houses. It was not yet enough to draw conclusions, but the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to align. Harcourt prepared his findings for William, careful to note the gaps that still remained. What struck them both was the pattern. The jewels were not simply disappearing at random. They were being moved with intention, and whoever was behind it understood both the value of the pieces and the means to disguise their sale. The investigation had shifted from suspicion to pursuit, and the next step would bring them dangerously close to the truth. The jewel trail. Harcourt's discovery of the diamond necklace was the first real crack in the polished facade of royal security. It was no longer a matter of rumor or idle curiosity. The necklace's provenance, though intentionally obscured in the Parisian auction records, carried traces of its true history. A skilled eye could see that the clasp was custom-made to fit the former queen's neck, and the arrangement of the stones matched perfectly with archival photographs taken decades earlier. What troubled Harcourt even more was the method of sale. The auction had been private, invitation only, and attended by a handful of elite collectors who had no interest in publicizing their acquisitions. That meant whoever was selling knew exactly how to keep the transaction quiet and the profits clean. The breakthrough reinvigorated the investigation. Harcourt began widening his search, tapping into discreet contacts in Geneva, Antwerp, and Dubai, cities where high-value gems could change hands without attracting attention. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Several pieces tied to the royal collection had surfaced under vague descriptions in auctions over the past 18 months. A sapphire ring listed simply as European royal origin. A brooch described as mid-19th century exceptional quality. Even a gold bracelet with an inscription in flowing script that closely resembled the handwriting of King George VI. Each sale was traced back to a different auction house, yet the administrative fingerprints were strikingly similar. The same legal representatives appeared repeatedly. The same luxury couriers were contracted to transport the items, and payments were routed through a small cluster of offshore accounts. Harcourt knew this level of coordination suggested a single guiding hand behind the operation. When he presented the growing list to Prince William, the room fell into an uneasy silence. William leaned back in his chair, staring at the photographs of the jewels laid out in front of him. Every piece carried not just monetary value, but an irreplaceable link to the monarchy's past. They were more than ornaments. They were chapters of history worn during coronations, state visits, and family milestones. To see them scattered into the private vaults of collectors was, to him, an act of erasure. The conversation turned to how these pieces could have left the palace without triggering alarms. Royal jewels were kept under strict watch, with multiple layers of checks for any movement in or out of the vaults. Yet Harcourt explained that someone with the right authority could bypass many of those safeguards. Temporary removals for cleaning, valuation, or public exhibitions required paperwork, but if the paperwork was signed by someone at the highest level, no one questioned it. That was the unsettling truth. Whoever was behind this had both the access and the authority to move the jewels without suspicion. The investigation now carried a sharper edge. Harcourt proposed tracing not just the jewels, but the handlers. Couriers, appraisers, and brokers often knew more than they admitted. In his experience, people involved in high-value transactions rarely kept silent forever, especially if they had been cut out of the profits. It was during a quiet meeting in a dimly lit cafe in Antwerp that Harcourt found his next lead. An aging gem appraiser, now retired, admitted over coffee that he had been asked to evaluate several pieces with royal characteristics for a private client 2 years earlier. He had been paid in cash and sworn to confidentiality, but the memory of the pieces had lingered with him. When Harcourt showed him photographs of the missing jewels, the man pointed to 3 without hesitation. He remembered them vividly. They had been brought to him by an intermediary who spoke with a refined English accent and claimed to represent a member of the household. Though he could not name the client, he had noted that the intermediary always took calls in French, a detail Harcourt tucked away for later. The trail was now warm. The jewels were not just vanishing. They were being moved with meticulous planning, through trusted channels, and always under the cover of legitimacy. The question of who stood at the center of this operation was becoming clearer, and soon Harcourt would find himself staring directly at a connection that even he had hoped not to see. The hidden middleman. The detail about the refined English accent and the casual use of French was enough to narrow Harcourt's search. Few within the extended royal circle possessed both the access and the cultural ease to operate across elite European markets. He began combing through discreet contacts who had worked with the monarchy in the past decade, focusing on those with a history of involvement in art or jewelry transactions. The name that surfaced again and again in hushed tones was Charles Everley, a former senior aide who had left palace service under vague circumstances 3 years earlier. Everley had once been entrusted with coordinating the movement of royal items for exhibitions and state events. It had been his role to liaise with couriers, appraisers, and security teams, ensuring that priceless pieces were handled with the utmost care. At the time, his departure was officially explained as an early retirement for personal reasons, but among those who knew him, there had been quiet speculation that he had fallen out of favor with certain senior figures. Harcourt suspected that Everley's skills and contacts would have made him invaluable to anyone seeking to remove jewels discreetly. Tracking Everley was not difficult. He had resurfaced in the luxury market almost immediately after leaving the palace, establishing a small consultancy that specialized in sourcing rare heritage items for private collectors. His name appeared in the periphery of at least 2 of the questionable auctions Harcourt had already identified, though never as a direct seller. Instead, he acted as a facilitator, introducing clients to auction houses or private brokers. Harcourt arranged a meeting under the guise of seeking advice for a wealthy client looking to acquire a historically significant tiara. They met in a quiet corner of an exclusive London club, the kind where conversations were never repeated outside the walls. Everley was as polished as the gems he once handled, dressed impeccably, his tone warm yet measured. He spoke freely about his work, offering tales of rare acquisitions and discreet negotiations, but Harcourt noticed how carefully he sidestepped any discussion of royal pieces. It was only when Harcourt casually mentioned a sapphire ring similar to one in the Queen Mother's collection that Everley's composure shifted for the briefest moment. His smile held, but his eyes sharpened, calculating. He responded with a vague remark about how many pieces change hands quietly without the world ever knowing, before steering the conversation back to neutral territory. By the end of their meeting, Harcourt was certain that Everley knew far more than he had admitted. A deeper background check revealed frequent trips to Geneva and Monaco over the past 18 months, often coinciding with the dates of the suspicious auctions. Passenger records also showed he had traveled twice with a woman listed under diplomatic clearance, which meant her identity was concealed from public logs. The threads were beginning to weave together. The middleman was not working alone. He was facilitating the movement of royal jewels for someone whose status allowed them to bypass every layer of scrutiny. And as Harcourt cross-referenced travel dates, auction schedules, and vault access logs, a name began to surface with unsettling clarity. A name that brought the investigation dangerously close to the highest ranks of the royal family: the unmasking. The name that emerged from Harcourt's research was one he had not wanted to see in black and white. Every document, every record, every coinciding date pointed in the same direction. The woman traveling under diplomatic clearance with Charles Everley was none other than Queen Camilla. The discovery was almost too stark to believe. She had the authority to access the royal vaults without question, the public role to justify wearing or transporting jewels, and the influence to ensure that paperwork was signed and sealed without scrutiny. Harcourt knew that such an accusation could not be made lightly. The evidence had to be irrefutable before he took it to Prince William. He spent the next 2 weeks verifying every detail. Passenger lists confirmed multiple joint trips to Geneva, Paris, and Monaco. Auction house staff, contacted under the pretense of vetting potential purchases, admitted off the record that a distinguished British woman had personally delivered pieces for valuation. The descriptions they gave, though cautious, left little doubt about her identity. In one case, a handler recalled the way she removed her gloves with deliberate grace before handing over a velvet box. Inside was a sapphire and diamond brooch, identical to one that had not been seen in the palace collection for nearly 2 years. When Harcourt finally compiled his findings into a leather-bound dossier, he felt the full weight of what he was about to hand over. It was not simply a matter of missing jewels now. This was a breach of trust at the highest level, one that could fracture the monarchy's carefully cultivated image. He requested a private audience with William, away from the usual meeting rooms, choosing instead a quiet study, lined with history books and maps. William listened in silence as Harcourt laid out the evidence piece by piece. The photographs, the timelines, the travel logs formed a damning mosaic. Each connection was precise, leaving little room for doubt. By the time Harcourt closed the dossier, the air in the room felt heavier, as though the weight of centuries of royal tradition pressed down on both men. For William, the revelation was more than a personal betrayal. It was a direct threat to the monarchy's integrity. The jewels were not just property. They were symbols of continuity, each one a tangible link to the past. To see them sold in secret to private collectors was to see parts of that history vanish forever. His first instinct was disbelief, followed quickly by a cold resolve. If this were true, it could not be ignored. But moving against a member of his own family, and one who held such a visible public role, would ignite a storm unlike any the palace had faced in decades. As the meeting ended, William kept the dossier on the desk in front of him, his gaze fixed on its leather cover. He understood that opening it again meant committing to a course from which there would be no return. And in the quiet that followed, it was clear that the decision he would soon make would alter the royal family forever. The confrontation. The decision to confront Camilla was not one William made quickly. For days, he carried the dossier with him, reviewing its contents in the early hours of the morning and late at night when the palace was still. Each time he opened it, the evidence was the same, cold and undeniable. Yet the act of placing it before her felt like stepping into uncharted waters. He knew that once the words were spoken, there would be no way to rewind them. This was not a disagreement over policy or a private family matter. This was an accusation that could topple reputations and redefine relationships forever. He chose the blue drawing room in Buckingham Palace, a space both formal and private with heavy drapes that kept the outside world at bay. Camilla arrived with her usual composure, her smile polite but guarded. She took a seat across from him, folding her hands in her lap, the very picture of royal poise. William began without ceremony, sliding the dossier across the table. He asked her to look through it before saying anything. She glanced at the cover but made no move to open it, instead lifting her eyes to meet his. "What is this about?" she asked, her tone even but edged with curiosity. William kept his voice steady as he explained the findings, detailing the auction records, the travel logs, and the testimony from those who had handled the jewels. With each piece of evidence he mentioned, Camilla's expression remained still, though there was a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. She did not deny traveling with Charles Everly, but she dismissed the connection to the missing jewels as a web of coincidences being stretched into a conspiracy. William pressed further, asking why certain heirlooms had not been seen in years and why their official records contained unexplained gaps. Camilla countered with claims that pieces were often moved quietly for restoration or discreetly lent for diplomatic purposes. It was, she insisted, part of the work no one outside truly understood. But when he asked for documentation of those loans, she paused for just a fraction too long before replying. The conversation grew heavier, the air thick with unspoken history and the fragile bond between stepson and stepmother. William's voice remained calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. He reminded her of the responsibility they all carried to safeguard the legacy entrusted to them, a duty that went beyond personal gain or private arrangements. Camilla bristled at the implication, her voice sharpening as she accused him of being swayed by palace gossip and ambitious advisors. The meeting ended without resolution. Camilla rose first, smoothing her jacket as she left the room, her posture unbroken, but her silence telling. William remained seated for several minutes after she was gone, staring at the closed door. The confrontation had not produced a confession, but it had confirmed something else. She was aware of the investigation, and now she knew how much he knew. The balance between them had shifted, and there would be no return to the quiet civility they had once maintained. The next steps would have to be decisive, and William understood that hesitation could cost the monarchy far more than jewels. The palace shockwave. The tension from the confrontation did not stay contained within the blue drawing room. By the next morning, subtle changes in the atmosphere of the palace were impossible to ignore. Staff members moved with a kind of strained politeness. Conversations cut short when certain figures walked past, and glances were exchanged in the hallways with an unspoken question lingering in the air. Though no official word had been given, the palace had its own way of sensing when the ground was shifting. The news of a serious dispute between William and Camilla had begun to circulate among the inner circle, carried on whispers and half-heard remarks. The courtiers closest to both of them found themselves caught in an uneasy balancing act. They knew better than to ask direct questions, yet they could not entirely mask their awareness that something significant had transpired. Even those not privy to details noticed the sudden absence of Camilla from certain engagements. A charity luncheon she had been scheduled to host was abruptly taken over by another senior royal. Her name quietly disappeared from the guest list of a gala she had confirmed only a week before. Meanwhile, William moved with deliberate composure in public, his expressions carefully measured during appearances. Privately, however, he convened with trusted advisors to discuss the implications of acting on Harcourt's findings. The issue was not only the removal of the jewels, but the fact that a member of the royal family could be accused of such a breach. Any step he took would invite scrutiny on the entire institution, and the fallout could be severe. The monarchy relied on the perception of unity, and to openly move against Camilla would shatter that image. Yet to remain silent risked losing far more the trust of the nation and the safeguarding of the crown's heritage. The press, ever attuned to subtle changes in royal schedules, began to take notice. Questions were raised in newsrooms about why Camilla's public appearances had dropped so suddenly. A handful of sharp-eyed reporters connected her recent trips abroad to dates of high-value auctions. While nothing concrete appeared in print, the speculation was already gathering momentum behind the scenes. Palace press officers worked to divert attention with other stories, but in an age of digital leaks and anonymous tips, containment was a fragile thing. Inside the walls of Buckingham and Kensington, the once comfortable rhythm of royal life was fractured. Even those who had no loyalty to either side felt the unease settle into daily routines. Meetings were shorter, conversations more guarded, and there was a palpable awareness that something was building toward an inevitable breaking point. William knew that his decision could not be delayed much longer. Harcourt continued to monitor the situation, reporting that at least one more piece of royal jewelry had quietly surfaced in a foreign collection. Each passing day made it clearer that hesitation was no longer an option. The palace was holding its breath, waiting for a signal of which way the storm would break, and William understood that when it did, nothing within the monarchy would be the same again. The official decree. The morning William decided to act was gray and still, the kind of London day where the air felt heavy before rain. He had spent the night in his study at Kensington Palace, the dossier lying open beside a pot of untouched tea. Harcourt's latest report confirmed what William had feared. Another heirloom, a diamond and emerald bracelet worn by the late Queen Mother, had been traced to a private vault in Zurich. The trail leading to it followed the same channels as the others, and the pattern was now undeniable. The time for private confrontation had passed. Action had to be public and irreversible. William's aides gathered in the early hours, their expressions taut as they reviewed the wording of the statement. Every sentence had to be precise, every word weighed for the impact it would carry. This was not just a family matter anymore. It was a constitutional decision, one that would set precedent for how the Crown dealt with internal breaches of trust. He understood that the statement could not accuse Camilla directly of theft without the legal framework to support it, but it could remove her title and positions under the authority granted to the heir apparent in matters of safeguarding royal assets. By mid-morning, the statement was finalized and signed. It was to be read from the palace press room, a rare step that signaled the gravity of the matter. When William entered, the room fell silent. Journalists who had been speculating for weeks leaned forward, pens poised, cameras ready. He stood at the lectern, his hands resting on the prepared text, and looked out over the assembled press. His voice was calm, but carried an edge that made the words land with precision. He spoke of the Crown's duty to preserve its heritage, of the trust between the monarchy and the public, and of the need for absolute accountability from those who serve within it. He announced that, effective immediately, Camilla would no longer hold the title of Queen Consort. Her patronages and ceremonial duties would be reassigned, and her public role within the royal family would cease. He expressed gratitude for her years of service, but made clear that certain standards could not be compromised. The statement was short, lasting less than 5 minutes, but its effect was immediate. Within moments, the announcement was breaking news on every major network. Social media erupted with shock, support, outrage, and speculation in equal measure. Analysts dissected his every phrase, noting the absence of any direct accusations, but also the unmistakable implication that the decision stemmed from serious wrongdoing. Inside the palace, the corridors were hushed. Staff members avoided each other's eyes, aware that history had just shifted in real time. Camilla, who had been informed privately of the decision hours before, had already left the residence. Her departure was discreet, her destination unknown. William returned to his study after the press conference, closing the door behind him. The decision was made, the title stripped, and the Crown's message was clear. Yet even as he sat alone, he knew the storm was not over. What had been spoken publicly was only part of the truth, and the repercussions would echo far beyond the walls of the palace. The legacy of the scandal. In the days following William's announcement, the monarchy moved through uncharted territory. The removal of Camilla's title sent ripples far beyond Britain, sparking headlines in every major capital. Royal commentators called it the most decisive action taken by a future monarch in living memory. A public declaration that no one, regardless of their position, was above the duty to protect the Crown's legacy. The palace's official line remained measured, but the unspoken reality was clear to anyone paying attention. Something had happened behind closed doors that was serious enough to warrant an unprecedented step. For the public, reactions were deeply divided. Supporters of William praised his courage, seeing the move as a signal that the younger generation of royals was willing to hold even their own family members accountable. Critics argued that the decision was too extreme, claiming it risked further fracturing an already fragile family dynamic. The speculation over the missing jewels only intensified, with journalists pursuing leads in Europe's auction houses and collectors' circles. Pieces long believed to be lost were suddenly the focus of investigative reports, and whispers about private sales linked to high-profile buyers began to surface in the international press. Within the palace, the atmosphere was one of careful recalibration. Official portraits were quietly updated to reflect the change in titles. Event programs were rewritten, seating charts adjusted, and ceremonial duties reassigned. The absence of Camilla at state functions was striking, a visual reminder of the consequences of crossing certain invisible lines. William kept his public comments to a minimum, focusing on his engagements and speaking more frequently about the importance of preserving national heritage. Behind the scenes, security around the royal vaults was tightened, access logs were digitized, and new oversight measures were put in place to ensure that nothing of value could leave without multiple levels of approval. Harcourt, his work complete, returned to his private consultancy, declining all requests for comment. Those closest to the investigation understood that the full truth would likely never be made public. Some details were too sensitive, some connections too damaging to expose without risking diplomatic fallout. But among the small circle who had handled the dossier, there was a shared understanding that the removal of the title had been both necessary and unavoidable. For William, the decision marked a turning point in how he viewed his role. It was not enough to inherit the crown. He had to defend it, even from threats within. The scandal had been a painful lesson in the cost of leadership, but it had also reinforced his resolve. The jewels, the vaults, the traditions were not relics of a bygone era, but living symbols of continuity, and their protection was non-negotiable. As the weeks passed and the media frenzy began to fade, one truth remained. The monarchy had weathered the storm, but it had been changed by it. The crown had drawn a line and, in doing so, had made it clear that its legacy would be guarded at any cost. The scandal that began with whispers of missing jewels ended with a decision that reshaped the monarchy. William's removal of Camilla's title was more than a disciplinary act. It was a declaration that the crown's integrity outweighed personal ties. The investigation had exposed vulnerabilities, but it had also reinforced a truth the public rarely saw, that safeguarding history sometimes demands painful choices. While the full story would remain locked behind palace doors, the message was clear. The treasures of the monarchy, both symbolic and real, would be protected with unwavering resolve, no matter who stood in the way.